In the next 10 minutes, I'll walk you step by step through how to sculpt this and simplify each stage. I'll also provide all the free assets I use so you can follow along. Let's get started. The first stage is always blocking. This means creating an approximate form of the mesh you're going to build. Most of the time you can do this by masking directly on your object, because that way it matches much more easily with the model you already have, especially for meshes like clothing, armor, or any wearable object that sites on the body, hands, or legs. You can simply mask an area and extract it with a bit of distance from the body based on your reference. And at this stage, I'm not worried about making the edges perfectly straight. I just extract a rough shape so I can clean it up in the next step. You can always smooth it a little after extraction to make the shape softer. Topology doesn't matter here either. I just want to create the objects I need. With this workflow I'm showing you, you can basically build anything you want. And I break it into 4 steps, sometimes 3 steps for some objects. But first we block, and then we create a clean topology before moving on to refining the forms. After you've masked and extracted the objects you need, now it's time to clean up their form and topology. That means creating clean edges, and if the object is supposed to be symmetrical, make sure to set that up properly. For example, with this armor piece on the arm, I can use dynamic symmetry. As I said, in this stage, only the form and cleanness of the object matter. Once you're happy with it, you can use zero measure so the edges become clean and smooth, just enough to keep the overall form. You don't need to make it extremely low poly. The focus here is only on building. Then you should add the necessary extrusion. If you have an edge that needs to be extruded or any loop, do it now, because by the end of this step, you should have a clean and solid form of the object. For things like clothes or leather pieces, you can delete the inner side first using the default polygroups, then mask the edges and delete the parts that fold too far inward. After that, zero mesh to clean and smooth everything. You can also use polish by futures to soften the edges. This is very useful. Then extrude the edges again and shape them according to your concepts and needs. Here my focus is only on clean edges and correct form. Sometimes I subdivide the mesh just to preview how it will look, then undo and go back to the lower level. And these meshes are usually very simple in form, and even with a standard zero measure you can achieve clean form and topology. Clean topology is very important because you need clean edges when extruding, and you want to be able to add high quality details later. This requires clean topology, not a messy dynamesh. For buckles, you can use my free pack available on Flipped Normals. It includes 40 free buckles in both modern and old style. You can use them in any project to speed up your workflow, and the link is in the description. Here I'm trying to place the belts around the buckles in a way that makes sense. For the belt itself, I only want to keep the upper part. I use polygroup by normals to turn each edge into a polygroup, then select the top and use delete hidden to remove it. Now use polish by futures to make the shape smooth and natural. And finally, I can add thickness with panel loops without polish or simply extrude inward. It doesn't matter, just make sure to add supporting edges in between so the mesh doesn't break when subdividing. And now everything is ready for the next stage. And now we move for refining. Before subdividing the meshes, we need to stabilize the edges. If they need supporting edges or bevels, add them now and then subdivide. After that, you can start creating the basic folds. At first, I go in rough with high intensity just to block the fold ideas. In this stage, make sure you're using references or that you've done this enough times before to know the general look. I personally didn't search for a special reference here, but if you take the time to gather accurate ones, your result will look much more realistic in the end. As you can see, I first create the folds and then I sharpen them with the damage standard brush, defining the creases and ridges better. And in this stage, we only need the main forms and folds, no fine details yet. We just refining the mesh. First add the necessary supporting edges, then subdivide, and then add folds that break the flat look. You can't add small details to a flat mesh. It needs proper form and a structure first. You can even use the cloth notch brush to create some forms or get ideas for fold directions. The most important thing in this stage is to convey the sense of the weight and pressure of each material with both large and small forms. For example, here the belt is pressing against the fabric. I sculpt around the belt so the fabric bulges up, and in the middle I push it down so the pressure feels realistic. The indentation need to look logical. I've seen many students simply place a belt on top of clothing and leave it completely flat, This is a mistake, dude. It looks artificial, like some AI generated image with no pressure on the fabric. So always create indentations and lift the sides with the standard brush. As you see, I first established the large forms, then add smaller ones. Between the belts, I use the move brush to push parts outward, and the areas under the belt I push inward, so the volume and pressure are felt correctly. It's very important that your forms aren't flat. This is absolutely crucial for clothing sculpting. Now I move onto the belts and give them a more random form with the standard brush. I add slight bumps to the edges, and where the buckles pulls, I push the area down to feel more compressed. This makes the indentations and bulges more visible and removes the solid plastic look. Here we are only focusing on form. You need to come with the feeling and the pressure between the materials. Now I go to the hand armor. By adding supporting edges, I keep the shape strong. If any extrusion are needed, they must also be done in this step before subdividing. Now let's move on to the final details. But before that, you need to give the mesh UVs so you can apply noise to it. The first noise is ZBrush default noise, which I only want to use slightly to add some variation and bump to the model. Then I will add the leather noise that comes with the project file. It's completely free to use. Once you're sure the intensity looks right, apply it to the mesh. After that, you can add the stitches to the edges, also included the project file, and it's free. You can duplicate the model, delete the subdivision levels, and drag the stitches onto it. Then separate them from mesh and extrude all the polygroups outward to give them more thickness, if you want, of course. After that, use damage standard brush to carve slightly underneath them, so the stitches look pressed into the fabric. This really makes your work feel more natural, and even during baking, it can generate excellent ambient occlusion from them. With the damage standard brush, I pick one of the ZBrush default alphas and use it in a spray mode over the model to create the leather scratches and imperfections. Always do this on a separate layer so you can later control the intensity. And for tears, I use ZBrush default /2 brush, which is super useful. It helps make the edges look more natural and add subtle rips where needed. And again, it's best to do it in a new layer so you can toggle them on or off. And always use references for this. It makes the result look much more believable. And be sure to spend time on this step. For fabric, the first step is to add random noise to give some variation and remove the flatness. Then apply the main noise or patterns included for free in the project file, and you can use it. But before doing that, make sure to automatically UV your mesh in ZBrush or in any other software if you prefer using polygroups. After that, once again, use the /2 brush to add rips along the edges and surface of the fabric. The whole process is actually very simple. UV the mesh, apply noise, add the fabric patterns, and then move to small details like scratches or rips. I also assign colors to the objects just to better visualize them in the final version and get a stronger feel for each material. And it's not absolutely necessary to give them colors in the noise section. For the belt, I repeat the exact same steps. Apply the leather noise, then use a /2 to add a rip along the surface and edges where the leather would naturally tear a bit. This makes it feel more handmade and as realistic as possible, you know. And of course, the more time you spend on this, the better and more detailed it will look. You can even assign a metal material to the buckle or shield so it stands out more. For the leather object on the arm, I again apply ZBrush default noise first, then the leather noise similar to the lower object but scale it slightly larger since I want it to look different. Then I add stitches along the edges, extrude them outward to make them thicker, and carve underneath with damage standard to make them feel embedded into the leather. Stitches are very important. Some people just drag them onto the surface without adding any pressure, which doesn't look convincing. But if you bake them, you can use these stitches details later in texturing to generate very realistic depth with cavity and AO maps. This can actually look even more natural than the default stitches in Substance Painter. Now moving to the armor on the arm. First, using one of the free orb brushes, I add the base shape of the metal with a hammered effect, but on a smaller scale. Then, with Trim Dynamic, I break up the edges slightly to create a chipped and worn look. Since this is a battle armor, It's natural for it to have damage. I don't want the edges to be perfectly clean because I want them to feel more random, you know. You can also add a small scratches. The brushes for this are all included in the project file. Then import alphas and drag them onto the mesh using the standard brush set to drag rect. And always do this on a new layer so you can later adjust the strength and intensity. And finally, you can add some noises as alpha on your standard brush or whichever brush you're comfortable with, and then lower their intensity through the layer system. You can also paint the metal directly or use mask by cavity for these layers and more interesting effects. I hope this short tutorial and the assets I shared have been helpful for you. I'd love for you to share your thoughts in the comments about this type of video and its pacing and how we could improve it. So, I will see you in the next week with a brand new challenge. Until then, just focus on your growth by practicing the things you've learned. See you soon.